So hi everyone, I'm going to try to speak up because I'm not mic'd, and I'm going to try to go a little bit fast because I have a lot to show you guys, and I want to cover everything. If you can't hear me at any point, just tell me that and I'll try to speak louder. So I'm Catherine D'Ignazio. I want to say thank you to Dietmar and Isabel for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be at Northeastern. My mom went to Northeastern actually, and my aunt, and well actually my cousin too. So I have a legacy here, I guess. But I'm also really excited about the new MFA in Information Visualization that's here because that's sort of the field that I'm orienting towards, is thinking about visualization in this expanded sense of the term, and I think it's a really interesting space to be in right now, and a space where there's a lot of room to sort of set the terms of what that field is all about. So I hope that the students are going there with gusto right now. So I'm going to talk tonight about art maps and civic engagement. I'm currently a research assistant at the MIT Center for Civic Media. And so these are the research directions that I'm going to talk about tonight. The first one, I'm going to actually start at the bottom of the list because they're sort of in chronological order from the bottom. So the first one I want to talk about is creative ways of engaging new publics in civic data and important issues. And so this one is really addressed by what I was doing before I went back to school at MIT at the Center for Civic Media. I come from a background, like a kind of dual background in software development and the arts. So I've been a software developer for 15 years, ever since the first .com boom. I've been writing code and developing web applications. Just really quickly, a couple of the things that I've developed. I was a front-end developer for the multimedia storytelling engine called Ziga, which is a way of kind of pulling in all sorts of different feeds and media sources across the internet, remixing them into slideshows, presentations, sound, video, and things like that. And then another recent project that is a little bit more in the civic space was called Enough Fear, where this was a Facebook application that it would basically recommend Americans and Iranians to befriend each other. It would kind of put you in touch with people from Iran. It would send you notifications about holidays happening in Iran so that you could send people, like a pomegranate or different things that represent the holidays, and vice versa for the Iranians could send you things on U.S. holidays. So there's kind of these themes here of connecting people and multimedia. And then I spent a long time as the lead artist and the director of the Institute for Infinitely Small Things, which I'll show you a couple of our projects tonight from the past. And so we are a institute, in the kind of artistic sense of the word. We're not actually a physical space, but we are a group, and we conduct creative, participatory research that is about public spaces, and it's about transforming public spaces. And instigating dialogue about democracy, spatial justice, and everyday life. So a lot of what we do are these strategies of performance, intervention, and what we mean by infinitely small things are not necessarily like the nanoparticles and things that you would associate with, MIT, but social and political tiny things. So tiny things that we pass by in our everyday lives and we don't notice. So as an example of what I mean by that are the street names. So the streets, like what street are we on right now? Leon or Leon? Does anyone know where that comes from? Or who that's named after? Nobody knows, right? So that's what this project was about. In this project called The City Formerly Known as Cambridge, we were commissioned to do a project. The Institute was commissioned by the Left Foundation and the Cambridge Arts Council. And we had already done a couple of mapping projects actually in the area, and we started by looking at some of the old historical maps of Cambridge. And then particularly what started attracting, that's kind of washed out, but what started attracting our attention were the names of the streets and the public places. And if you kind of dig deeper and look into the history behind them, it's pretty much exactly what you might expect. It's all of these basically dead white guys who founded Harvard University. So that's who's represented. Fine, like that's really important, but then also Cambridge has a very diverse population. So there's certain neighborhoods, like around Central Square, 35% African American. There's a significant Haitian population, Brazilian population. We talked to the guy at the, it's like the Massachusetts Alliance of Portuguese Speakers, which is in Cambridge, and he said, well, the one sign that we did, the one street we did get named after the Cardinal Maderos, so that after this cardinal, they actually spelled the name wrong the first time we were selling it. So we're like, okay, what can we do about this? So we initiated this sort of speculative project which was about collecting data and then producing a new map of Cambridge. So our basic research question was, well, what would the city of Cambridge look like if we could all rename it right now? And so to that end, what we did is we set up what we called our little renaming station. And this took about 2 years, actually, of data collection. So this is a pretty significant effort. And so what we would do is we would set up our renaming station. We had these, we designed these custom tables that actually fit in the back of one of our station wagons. So we kind of had this unfolding furniture schema. And then at the site, it was kind of like this little roving library because we had all these historical materials on where the names in Cambridge came from, so people could look up the names of their streets. So like you guys could look up Leon or Leon or whatever it is and see like, well, where does that actually come from? Who is that named after? Who's that commemorating? And then at the booths, people would submit a new name for the place that they wanted to rename. And so we tried to partner with all these different community events. So this, for example, was a night out against crime at a local school. We went to farmers markets. We went to a lot of the commercial districts like Harvard Square and things like that. And so you'd sit down, kind of browse through the research material, and you'd submit a new name, and then you'd also say why you wanted to rename something. So this is just all these shots of our data collection process. And so for a while, all of the data existed just on a website because we were transcribing it as it was coming in. But then eventually what we did is, after about 2 years of data collection, what we tried to do is collect data in all of the different neighborhoods around Cambridge. We produced our map of the city formerly known as Cambridge. And on this map are only the new names that were submitted. So things like the Cambridge Common, that like yellow blob right there. The Cambridge Common was renamed to that place where freaks gather to hula hoop and do other circus tricks. Harvard Square was renamed to Cash Money Land. There was a, oh, and I should say, so a lot of these are funny, but then there's also a really important aspect of how they actually are very socially significant. So the place where freaks gather to hula hoop and do other circus tricks, so that actually is a social use of that space. And the people that renamed it to that, so there actually are these bunches of people, especially in better weather than right now, they go and gather and they do circus tricks and practice circus arts there. And the people that named it that were said freaks, like they were kind of representing themselves on the map. So people renamed for those reasons, so kind of how the space is used now. There were kids who came in, so a kid renamed their school from the King's Amigos School to the Farming Cows School, and the reason that the kid gave was, I just think it would be fun to have kids at school, or to have cows at school. There was a family that renamed their little street after, their name was Kontos, and the husband's parents had emigrated here from Greece. So they renamed that after to commemorate their history. Other places, like this is the Area 4 neighborhood of Cambridge. So that's, kind of where does Area 4, that's a pretty poor name, right? So somebody came in and renamed that to Candyland as a way of commemorating the history of the Necco candy factories. There's still actually a Tootsie Roll factory over there as well. And then, of course, with doing this, we met a number of people who were actually working on their own renaming projects in the city. So this gentleman here renamed Massachusetts Avenue to Prince Hall Boulevard. And Prince Hall was one of the first African-American Masons, and he fought with George Washington in the Revolutionary War. So a lot of kind of interesting things come to the surface. So there's a couple other aspects about the project I should probably explain. So one thing is that everybody who wrote down a story also submitted their address, and we mailed them a copy of the map once it was produced. So it's kind of like thinking about like who is the audience for this. It really is kind of like this closed loop. So everybody kind of gets the map back for the thing that they participated in. They kind of get something back for that. And then the other aspect of it was it involved money. So if you came in and were like, I want to rename Massachusetts Avenue, and we would be like, great, write it down, give us your story, and then you come in and you say, I want to rename Massachusetts Avenue, we would say, give us a quarter. And then the next person would be like, give us 50 cents. So in some sense, in this like very small way, we wanted to make a reference to this idea of space and money being linked. And so on the back of the map where we publish all the stories, it also publishes, kind of how valuable it was in our system. And yeah, so this is the front. This is the front of the map, and then this is the back. And so we tried to sort of call out these significant historical naming events that have happened in Cambridge as well. And so everybody, whether or not your name made it to the front of the map, everybody's name and story made it on the back of the map. So this is like this huge index of all of the data that we collected that you can look up by the name of the original street. So I want to switch gears to a more individual project quickly. Again, a lot of the work that I've done, you'll see that maps and geography, both the making of maps and the unmaking of maps is kind of this thread that runs through my work and research. And so this is a case, in the previous case we were sort of making a new map. This is a case where I'm kind of unmaking this map of the City of Boston evacuation routes. So this is 2006, 2007, the City of Boston just all of a sudden started putting up these evacuation route signs. Like, have you guys seen these? These are still up. Yeah, people have seen these. So all of a sudden these things just went up. And so this was really curious to me. At the time I was researching a lot the sort of effects, the post 9/11 effects, and really emotionally speaking, but then also on public. This is a very different way of calling on us to be citizens in the world, right? When you go in public space, it's not like, in the Habermas ideal of public space is like all of us step equally into public space and we dialogue about democracy and we debate the like issues of our time and whatever. But in this case, in public spaces now, we're being told to be suspicious of our fellow people. We're being told to report people to authorities. We're basically becoming kind of like these citizen spies. Although we're untrained, so we generally tend to racially profile people and do bad things like that. And so I was interested in how has this kind of fear infiltrated itself into our public spaces, and how can we measure the fear that it is then kind of inflicting upon us? And so I started being really interested in these. They just kind of all of a sudden popped up. So I went and I did some research into the actual evacuation route system. It's like $1 million system. The city received money from the Department of Homeland Security. It was criticized by all sorts of security experts on various sides of the political spectrum for basically being ineffective. So evacuation routes tend to be for, at least in the South where I'm from, they tend to be for hurricanes. You'll notice, it's a little washed out here, but this is the ocean. And the routes are going right along the water. So this is not an evacuation route system for hurricanes. It's not taking you outside of that purview. So it's supposed to be an all hazards evacuation route system. But what does all hazards mean? It's like infrastructure failure, bombs, terrorism, bioterrorism, snow, hurricanes, anything. So there's that. It's super car centric, which is another thing that got criticized on. There's complete lack of coordination with other townships, which also got criticized. So it's like, okay, this is completely ineffective as a kind of urban planning type thing. But what it does potentially work really well as is art, right? It works really well in the symbolic dimension because what it's doing is that it's reminding us that we're vulnerable. So in a way, it's like reminding us that we are at war, that we are kind of we might potentially need to evacuate, right? And so I started seeing its main function being more in this symbolic and poetic dimension rather than in the kind of more pragmatic dimension. So my research question here was, how do you measure fear in public space? So how can we start to measure these transformations that have been taking place since 9/11? And so what I determined to do was a very artistic strategy in line with its completely non-functional status of evacuation routes. And I decided to try to get some numbers involved. I just decided to run all of the evacuation routes and count my breaths as I ran. And so that's why the project is called It Takes 154,000 Breaths. I ran, I called these running performances. So I ran with a speaker on my back, so that audio that you just heard, I was broadcasting it out into the world around me. I was also very heavily kind of geared up, collecting all sorts of statistics and things about my running, GPS coordinates and things like that. And then on the website for the project, each run I logged with all of the data, the map that was associated with it, and actually had a podcast of the breaths that I collected for each run. So you can see this was my first test. It's pretty short. There were 533 breaths for this 15-minute run. And actually did get a couple people subscribing to the podcast of the breathing, which was pretty amazing. And then when the project was active, when I was actively doing this, the front page of the website would update at each time I ran and added more breaths. And then this was also realized, so there's these performances combined with the website, and then at a later date, it was realized as a kind of archive of breaths. So in this case here, this is a sculptural representation in which each of these jars corresponds to one run. So there were 26 runs. The size of the jar corresponds to how many breaths I collected on the run, as does the size of the speaker. And so this kind of breathing collection of jars, it's a very anxious installation piece because they're all breathing at the same time with the soundtrack. And that's just more of a detail shot. And then I also realized this as an installation at the ICA Boston in 2008 as well. And so in this case, the evacuation route map was on the floor in that tape it's like that reflective material that you use for stop signs. It has that really amazing iridescent quality. And then also the sounds of the breathing, along with a custom piece that I created that was more site-specific for the ICA called Exit Strategy. This is also right as the U.S. was starting to draw down from Iraq as well, and we were talking a lot at the time about exit strategy, like what's our exit strategy? So this is... it goes on, and that's just kind of a short clip. But basically, the exit strategy video was me trying to exit all of the doors in the ICA Boston. It has this really kind of amazing sound quality because of the way that the sound of the doors echoes throughout those spaces. And then the breathing sounds were also in the stairwell at the ICA Boston. So I'm going to talk about one more sort of art-related project and then shift into my current research at the Center for Civic Media. Again, this project started from that investigation of fear in public places, and I was thinking about, well, like how has fear made itself manifest in the landscape? Like how do you visualize fear, right? And I was thinking, well, okay, there's no greater symbol of that than this new 700 miles of fence that we have recently built at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so that was 2006, Bush authorized the Secure Fence Act, and we've gone ahead and built up all this fence. But the interesting thing about this particular fence is that it's in the backyard of this woman here, Ofelia Rivas, who I ended up meeting as part of the research for this, and she ended up being my collaborator on this project and on some subsequent collaborations. And Ofelia is a Tohono O'odham Native American. And so this is the sort of map. These are the traditional O'odham lands, and as you can see, they massively straddle the U.S.-Mexico border. So like this is Arizona. So that's like almost the whole bottom part of Arizona is traditional O'odham land. The reservation borders 75 miles of the border. It's the second largest Indian reservation in the United States, second to the Navajo. And it turns out, also in doing research for this project, that the President Franklin Pierce, who signed the Gadsden Purchase into law, which created that border, I'm like directly descended from him on my maternal grandmother's side. So this is like a very, I don't know, this is kind of a weird, strange, weird twist of the project. So in any case, so this is Ophelia's backyard, and so in 2006, the U.S. government was basically like, we are building a fence, and it's going to divide you from your community, because about 25% of Otum still live on the Mexican side, and Otum they have tribal ID cards, and theoretically should be free to cross. Every Otum has access to the services on the U.S. side, and up until this fence, it hadn't as much mattered that it was Mexican or U.S. It's Otum land. Ophelia herself has actually had a gun held to her head by a U.S. Border Patrol officer and asked, "Are you a U.S. citizen or are you a Mexican citizen?" And she would just, she always refuses to answer. She says, "I am Otum. Like, I am not from this and I'm not from that. I am an Otum citizen." And she has these amazing stories to tell. And even just being there the couple times that I've been there, speaking with her, like the very first visit I went down there, it was myself and my sister and my young baby at the time, and we had 2 cars. We were leaving her house, which is down there on the reservation, coming back up the road, maybe like a quarter mile from her house. She was following us because we were all driving back to Tucson, so she was in a separate car. A Border Patrol officer pulled her over and was sort of talking to her in the car. My sister and I turned around, went back, we were like, "Hey, what's going on?" And the Border Patrol was like, "Oh, are you with her?" We were like, like, I guess so, except that this is her home. And she had just invited us into her home and her world and her land. We're like, "Yeah, I guess so." And then he said, "Oh, okay, you're free to go." So we're like, this is a very wrong situation where, if you can imagine being pulled over like on your same street block and being like, "Where are you going? Show me your papers. What right do you have to be here? But this is your ancestral homeland." There's just something really wrong with that. So this fence has instituted a number of problems for the Otum. Now, for Ophelia to visit her father's village, which is on the other side, she actually has to drive like 5 hours out of her way, because you have to now cross at these official crossing points because of the fence. So she has to drive up, over, and around. There have been Otum who are doing their ceremonial walks on the border who have been arrested and detained for doing that. Otum, because they are brown looking, often get detained and put in jail temporarily while they figure things out. And so this is a really kind of major problem. So the Institute for Infinitely Small Things has been invited at the same time to do an installation on the campus of UMass Amherst. And so we were talking with Ophelia and thinking, well, what can we do? We're thinking, well, why don't we bring your friends there? And so the research question here is, like, what happens when you divide a community that's not meant to be divided? And so what we did was basically just try to transplant that fence to the UMass Amherst campus. So we divided it on its north-south axis. We created basically a 2-scale photographic replica of the fence, but we used more like the language of construction to talk about it. The kind of fiction we were trying to create here was like, well, maybe this is coming in the future. We used that banner material, the photo mural type stuff that you use to wrap construction sites and tell people about the great things that are coming. And even to perpetuate that fiction a little bit, we actually even installed these fake posts here. And basically just barred people from going, although there were actually openings that people could sneak through. We repurposed an information kiosk, so each day this would change and ask them these sort of border-related questions as they crossed. There was a sound installation in this event. And then we also organized a number of events on the campus. So we worked with the anthropology department, the Native Studies department to have a symposium on Native American sovereignty. And we led tours of the U.S.-Mexico border, but on the campus of UMass Amherst as part of this. So I want to sort of pivot here, so from this project, and shift into the Center for Civic Media, because this is where I've been for the past 2 years, and talk a little bit about my work for the Center for Civic Media. So the Center for Civic Media, we do a couple of things. Originally, I came here because I was like, okay, I do software development, and I do these sort of critically engaged art projects and maps and this stuff, and like, how can I bring these things together in the service of civic engagement? So at the Center for Civic Media, we do 2 things. So a lot of, which is under the auspices of the Center for Civic Media, And this is all around water quality data and building up open hardware and open software tools for gauging water quality. And so this is a collaboration, this is a very collaborative project. I'm only working on a small part of this project, but I'm really excited about it. So I'm working with a group called Public Lab, which is a do-it-yourself, basically a civic science community that's oriented around environmental justice issues. And we're working with the Mystic River Watershed Association, which does a lot of community and volunteer monitoring of water quality in the Mystic River. And so our basic questions are, how do we make water quality monitoring cheaper for community organizations, and how do we engage new audiences in the conversation around water quality? And so this is me. I've been making these maps of different rivers around, mostly just my neighborhood at the moment. We have an IOB, trying to raise money for this project. And it basically consists of these 5 things, which I won't go into too much detail, but open communities, basically there's a community organizing component, there's an open hardware component, so we're actually developing some really low-cost prototypes for doing water quality testing in your community. Open software. Open data, this is a huge problem where water quality data comes in all shapes and sizes and forms, and it's often super proprietary, so it becomes really hard to compare across different platforms and formats. And then open education, so thinking about how do we engage new publics in the conversation about water both inside and outside the classroom. And that's kind of where I'm focusing. Does anyone know this movie? Shout it out. Three Amigos. So I was really inspired by this, and also this idea of engaging new audiences in water quality data. And so I was imagining this system where, what if you could actually talk with your water body? So what if your water body talked to you and you talked back to it? What would be a way that's natural maybe for humans to talk to the water body? Maybe that's like through text messaging or tweets, through natural language kind of things. And so I developed this, which is, there's sensors here that are actually immersed in this case a creek or a brook, and that are continuously monitoring and sensing and broadcasting that data. And it's networked and broadcasting this data to Twitter. And I'm going to come back to this because it probably makes absolutely no sense right now, but I'm going to come back to a video at the end of my talk that will make it all completely clear what this thing is doing. And I should say this is very much a prototype right now, so it's in the stages of development. So to come back to the news and geographic diversity question. So looking at the news media as a kind of an ecosystem, one of the first projects I worked on at Civic Media, which is an ongoing project, is a project that maps 2 plus, now it's actually about 2.5 years of data of the Boston Globe. And so in this project, we are interested in using it as a prototype for how we can take the news media and map it at scale. But first I wanted to start locally and regionally with the Globe. And so some of our questions were, is news coverage distributed equally? I mean, of course it's not, right? But what factors can explain the unequal distribution of attention? Which neighborhoods, which towns get more attention versus less attention? And then how do we assess qualitative measures, meaning more like frames? So like when the Boston Globe talks about Brookline, how does it talk about Brookline versus talking about Roxbury? So these are deeply interesting to us. So the first thing we did with the data was just kind of throw it up on a map and say, well, like where does the Boston Globe cover? And quickly we realized that a lot of the international coverage of the Boston Globe is actually local. I mean, this is basically local news, because it's about Giselle and so on. So we said, okay, let's focus very tightly and regionally, and so on. So the interesting view is here. We are interested in measuring how the attention is distributed. So which towns get more and less numbers of articles. So we're thinking, how do you adjust this for some kind of equity index? So we were thinking, we came up with this idea of articles per capita as basically a measure of, is the amount of media that a place is getting proportional to about the right number of people that are in it. So more densely populated areas should get more attention, and less densely populated areas should get less attention. And so when we did this, the sort of interesting spatial pattern that emerges, and this is you totally expect, right? The center of Boston is where a lot of the news that's reported happens and takes place. Does anyone know what that is? Anyone from Boston?
Is it the old mayor's neighborhood? Hyde Park?
No.
Virtual?
Does anyone like football?
Is it Foxborough? Yeah.
It's Foxborough. So it's where the Patriots are playing. So there's clearly lots of sports coverage going on. Then the interesting pattern here is that, so these are the different neighborhoods in Boston. And they get relatively much, again, we're talking about per capita, so it's not straight numbers of articles, but they get relatively much less attention than, say, the northwest suburbs, like Concord, Lincoln, Sudbury, and then some of the towns on the North Shore, a couple towns here on the South Shore. And so that was kind of an interesting spatial pattern. So like, so is this related to income, for example? Like, are we looking at, towns that are more, that are higher income? Do they get more attention? And in fact, we ran all these statistics on it, and really nothing correlated with the news attention. So there is no kind of reveal that like income is the factor. The only thing we really found that correlated with news attention was indeed population, which in a sense we're already accounting for here. And so we're thinking, so what some of the other things that might explain that variation are like where the reporters live, maybe where the readers live of the Globe, crime news, and not explaining all the variation is probably a good thing, because you don't want to necessarily have a statistical model for news. And so one of the ways that we try to get at the qualitative framing, again, like when the frame, like when the Boston Globe talks about Roxbury, what do they talk about? So when you click, you guys can actually go out, the tool is live still, and it pulls in data from the Globe every day. So you can go out and sort of explore this and play with it. We wanted to give a sense of like what they're covering in relationship to those places. So we created this idea of place words and headlines. You can browse through all the recent headlines from that particular geography. And then the place words are words that are somewhat unique to that place and then also occur with some measure of frequency as well. Again, in the Globe's reporting. So when you look at what that looks like for somewhere like North Adams, a lot of the words are arts related, so relating to Mass Mocha and the kind of shows and things that are going on out there. So when the Globe talks about North Adams, it's seeing the arts. Again, so Foxborough, basically the Foxborough is the Patriots here. So Patriots game, Belichick, Brady, season, like all of these are words that are relating to football more or less. Cambridge, a lot of words that relate to the educational institutions, the companies, technology. Then the starkest one that we have found was Mattapan, and in particular at the time that the screenshot was taken, basically all of these words are words that relate to violence, crime, and punishment, right? So these guys up here, these are sort of these protagonists in this ongoing trial from the Mattapan massacre. A lot of these, like Suffolk is the court, jurors, judge, testimony, shooting, acquitted, and so on and so forth. And so it's not like people at the Boston Globe are sitting around and going like, let's definitely only cover Mattapan in terms of violence. But the interesting thing about these tools, particularly if you're thinking about them being used in an editorial or a journalism context, is that you can get insight into these kind of like the kind of residue or the effects of your editorial decisions, right? And then you can start to correct for those things. And I should say the Boston Globe was actually our partner on this project as well. And felt, I think rightly so, very kind of challenged and sort of conflicted about some of the results that came out around these geographies. And so what we're doing as this kind of next step, what we're writing a research paper about now, is the idea of doing what we did with the Mapping the Globe, but taking it to scale. And so that's what I spent a lot of last spring doing, was building a technology where we can take in, like huge data sets, so you're talking like millions of articles or something like that, and then actually be able to map those at scale. And so that's kind of a hard problem. If you think about looking at a news article and seeing, well, where is this news article about? And that's actually a complicated question, because a lot of times a news article can mention many different places, and the existing technologies can pick up the places, but then you have to say, well, like, what is it really about? And so that's what we developed, is a technology with natural language processing and so on, which I won't really go into the details of, but where with about 85% reliability, we can identify, at least at the country level, where an article is about. And so what that opens up to doing is some really interesting stuff at a global scale. This is a very small prototype, but you can go check this out. This is just a month of data from 3 different news sources. And so what this enables us to do is say, well, how does the New York Times see the world? Versus how does the BBC see the world? Versus how does the Huffington Post see the world? And so on and so forth. Like, we're building it out so that there could be more sources and more time frames as well. And again, looking at this question of not just quantity of coverage, but then when the New York Times talks about Syria, what is it talking about? Like, what people show up in relationship to Syria, and then what are the key words that it associates with Syria? And so that takes me into the last project that I want to talk about, which is where I'm going with my own thesis in this area. So we're writing a research paper right now about using it's called geoparsing technology at scale to process these many tons of articles and make some conclusions about, sort of who's covering what and what kind of biases, what can explain the biases of the news media towards particular geographies and not. But I was interested in a more sort of personal take on this. So in a sense, if you look at the work like this is really thinking a lot about the supply side of the media ecosystem, so thinking about like how do editors make their decisions and how do we look at issues of bias in the news media. And then I was thinking, well, why do we read or consume the kind of media that we read? And how might we kind of re-engineer that as well? And so what I'm building right now, I'm calling it a personal media geography browser. It's called Terra Incognita, which of course is a term that comes from many of the maps from the age of exploration, where the guys would come over from Europe and come explore, and then anything that they hadn't explored would be called Terra Incognita. Now of course there were actually people living here that knew what was going on, but the guys over there did not. But I think it's still a powerful, it's like a complicated metaphor in terms of critical cartography, but it's kind of a powerful metaphor for exploration and thinking about, well, what do we not know, basically. And so in a way this is to counteract this problem that we have on the internet where, a lot of what we get in terms of news now comes to us via friends, via search. So technologies, pulling technologies like search, I go and I look for something, so I know what I want. Or it comes through social media, so I get news through what my friends are reading, or it comes through things like recommendation systems, Amazon or Netflix or something like that. And so it's like, how do we get out of those, what you might call filter bubbles, right? How do we get out of those and, get a little bit of what you might call serendipity in terms of how we discover and consume information on the internet. So there's 4 aspects to what I'm building right now. This is all very much in development, so I don't have really anything awesome to show you yet. But I think it's a game. I put an exclamation point because I'm not sure. So I was kind of emphasizing it in my own head. It's definitely a monitoring system with personal analytics. So what it is, it's a browser extension. So it sits like in your browser. Right now it's just like you haven't read about these particular countries, you haven't read about these particular cities. But then instead of telling you where you have been, it's about orienting you to where you haven't been, where you haven't read about. And so that's where the news recommendation and discovery system comes in, where it's actually going to be offering you, like here, I see you haven't read about the Ukraine, here's what you might consider looking at. So this is sort of a technical diagram, but the important thing here is that, this is you browsing the web. When you open a new tab, that's when you see basically your Terra Incognita, where you haven't been in the world. And that's the Chrome extension sitting there doing processing and talking to the server. And so your map might look, what I do read about, so I actually did this for a week of my browsing. It's like, this is pretty poor. Like, these are the only countries I read about in 1 week. And then here's the countries that I don't know, that I haven't read about, right? So ideally, this is just concept sketches right now, but ideally in this system you can like go click, and then you would be taken to somewhere that is hopefully high quality article about that location. So as the last thing, I just wanted to end with the video that will explain that weird talking flower in the creek. Let me just switch into this, and then we can answer questions.
inches deep and my temperature is 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Feeling groovy. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Feeling groovy. Knock knock. Who's there? Water. Water who? What are you doing in my creek? I am rolling on the floor, laughing out loud. If the humidity is 85%, does that mean we're about to get a wintry mix? What is a wintry mix, anyway?
And it tweets too, so this one is a tweet.
At Bob 1977 says, at the babbling brook, how's the water? I say at Bob 1977, the sound of rushing water puts me to sleep. Laugh out loud. But in all seriousness, folks, I'm pretty healthy at the moment, even good enough to drink. Holding strong at 5.25 inches deep. Last week at this time I was just 4 inches. It goes so fast. At Stantaman asks me, what's new in the babbling brook? Well, at Stantaman, the biggest change for me is the increased flow. I'm on an extra gallon per minute since yesterday. At 7.2, my pH is balanced and fair. What about yours at Joe.P?
I'm going to stop in there. This is on YouTube if you want to watch the whole video though. So let's see, I think I'm going to end there. Let me just make sure that I'm ending there. Yes, I'm ending there. So, thanks really so much for having me.